Long before animals walked the land, before forests stretched across continents, before even the first tree took root, there was a quiet, invisible revolution. It did not roar, it did not burn, it did not crash from the sky, and yet it changed Earth more completely than almost any event in its history. This is the story of the first plant that transformed a lifeless world into the living planet known today. More than 450 million years ago, Earth looked nothing like it does now. The continents were barren, stripped of color and texture, shaped only by wind and water. There were no forests, no grasslands, no flowers. The land was a hostile place, bombarded by intense ultraviolet radiation, battered by extreme temperature swings, and devoid of the oxygen-rich atmosphere that modern life depends on. Life, as far as we know, existed only in the oceans. But beneath the surface of shallow waters, something extraordinary was already happening. Tiny, simple organisms, green algae, were quietly harnessing sunlight. Through photosynthesis, they were converting carbon dioxide and water into energy, releasing oxygen as a byproduct. At first, this oxygen dissolved into the oceans or reacted with minerals, but over time, it began to accumulate in the atmosphere. Scientists believe that somewhere along the edges of these ancient waters, a crucial transition began. Some of these algae started to adapt to life outside the water. It was not a sudden leap, but a slow and uncertain process. The earliest pioneers likely clung to damp surfaces, muddy shorelines, wet rocks, places where moisture still lingered. These were not plants in the way they are recognized today. They had no roots, no leaves, no stems, but they represented something new, life on land. Among the earliest known examples of these primitive land plants is a form similar to what is now called liverworts. These small, flat organisms spread across surfaces like a living film. They absorbed water directly through their tissues and relied on moist environments to survive. Yet, despite their simplicity, they possessed a remarkable ability, the capacity to endure the harsh conditions of land, even if only briefly. Over millions of years, natural selection refined these early forms. Some developed protective coatings to prevent drying out. Others evolved structures to anchor themselves more securely to the ground. But perhaps the most important innovation was the development of a waxy layer known as the cuticle, which helped retain moisture. This single adaptation allowed plants to survive longer outside of water, opening the door to further evolution. As these early plants spread, they began to alter the planet in subtle but powerful ways. Their presence on land initiated a process that would reshape Earth's surface. When these organisms died and decomposed, they contributed organic material to the soil. Before this, soil as it is known today did not truly exist. The land was mostly bare rock and sediment. Plants helped break down these materials, both physically and chemically, gradually creating the first true soils. Their roots, or root-like structures, also played a critical role. By penetrating rock and stabilizing loose material, they reduced erosion and changed how water moved across the landscape. Rivers and streams began to behave differently. Sediment patterns shifted. The very shape of the continents started to evolve under the influence of plant life. At the same time, the atmosphere was undergoing a transformation. With more plants performing photosynthesis on land, oxygen levels continued to rise. This was not an immediate change, but over millions of years. The cumulative effect was profound. The increase in oxygen made the atmosphere more stable and eventually allowed for the formation of the ozone layer. This protective shield reduced the intensity of harmful ultraviolet radiation reaching the surface, making the land even more hospitable for life. This moment marks one of the most important turning points in Earth's history. The first land plants did not just survive, they engineered the conditions for future life. Without them, the evolution of complex terrestrial ecosystems would have been impossible. As time progressed into the Silurian and Devonian periods, plants became more sophisticated. Some began to develop vascular systems, internal structures that allowed them to transport water and nutrients more efficiently. This innovation enabled plants to grow taller and spread further from water sources. No longer confined to damp edges, they began to colonize vast areas of land. One of the earliest known vascular plants is a species called Cooksonia. It was small, only a few centimeters tall, with simple branching stems and spore-producing structures at the tips. It still lacked true leaves and roots, but it represented a major step forward. Its internal transport system allowed it to stand upright, reaching towards sunlight in a way earlier plants could not. This vertical growth had significant consequences. As plants grew taller, they began to compete for light. This competition drove further evolutionary innovation, eventually leading to the development of leaves, more complex roots, and stronger support structures. The stage was set for the rise of forests. But even before forests appeared, these early plants were already reshaping the climate. By drawing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere during photosynthesis, they contributed to a gradual cooling of the planet. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, and reducing its concentration can lower global temperatures. Geological evidence suggests that this process may have played a role in triggering ancient glaciations. At the same time, the accumulation of plant material began to influence the carbon cycle in new ways. Dead plants that were buried before fully decomposing could become trapped in sediments, locking away carbon for millions of years. This process would later give rise to vast deposits of coal, but its origins can be traced back to these early plant communities. The transformation evolution was not limited to the physical environment. The presence of plants on land created new opportunities for other forms of life. Microorganisms began to interact with plant roots, forming early symbiotic relationships. Fungi, in particular, are believed to have played a crucial role in helping plants absorb nutrients from the soil. These partnerships, known as mycorrhizal associations, still exist today and are essential to many ecosystems. Eventually, animals began to follow. The first terrestrial arthropods, ancestors of insects and spiders, appeared, likely feeding on plant material or the microorganisms associated with it. The land, once barren and hostile, was becoming a dynamic and interconnected ecosystem. Yet the identity of the first plant is not tied to a single species. It is better understood as a lineage, a series of evolutionary steps that transformed simple aquatic algae into the complex land plants that would dominate the planet. Scientists continue to study fossils, molecular data, and living plant relatives to piece together this story. There is still debate about the exact timing and sequence of these events, but the overall picture is clear. The transition of plants from water to land was gradual, complex, and immensely significant. What makes this transformation so remarkable is not just its scale, but its subtlety. There was no single moment when the world suddenly changed. Instead, countless small innovations accumulated over millions of years. A protective coating here, a stronger structure there, a slightly more efficient way to capture sunlight or retain water. Each change built upon the last, creating a cascade of consequences that reshaped the planet. Today, the legacy of those first plants is everywhere. Every forest, every field, every breath of oxygen in the air can be traced back to that ancient transition. Modern plants, from towering trees to delicate flowers, are the descendants of those early pioneers. Even the crops that sustain human civilization owe their existence to this deep, evolutionary history.